we can, since you already touched upon several issues, then go a step further to the latest news, where we say, okay, there were use of chemical weapons in Syria, and in the end, I mean 2017, but especially 2018, there were strikes by the UK, France, and the US in retaliation of the use of chemical weapons. And what we see is that France and the US, they didn't even bother to give a legal justification. On the other hand, the UK clearly said that it was legal according to the principle or the premises of humanitarian intervention. So here we're having R2P, we're having responsibility while protecting, and now we have suddenly the emergence again of humanitarian intervention, like a little bit of a zombie that is coming back, that we might thought we had eradicated. So how do you see those concepts? How do you see the current scenarios? How do you see the deadlock?
We always need to remind ourselves that use of force is not the be-all and end-all of R2P. It's just one mechanism, and at the most extreme end of the spectrum, for dealing with extreme situations when they have got completely out of hand. Use of force against the will of the country in question, coercive force. It's only in those cases, and of course the bar is always going to be very high indeed, and it should be very high before the use of force is ever embraced. When we wrote our original report, we were very concerned to make clear that use of force needed to satisfy two big boxes, in fact 3 big boxes when you think about it, preconditions. It had to be legal, it had to be legitimate, and it also had to be practically deliverable. And we had something to say certainly about legality, something to say a lot about legitimacy. We didn't have a lot to say about practical deliverability, but in the real world that becomes very important indeed. So when we talk about any of these cases that you might want to get onto, about whether they're appropriate cases for use of military force or not, whether it's the response to the chemical weapons use in Syria and Douma in April this year, or whether it's Venezuela or whether it's Myanmar or anything else, let's just, before we get to any of those cases, let's just get clear what the basic principles are here, because they were pretty clearly articulated in that report and pretty clearly understood by, I think, the wider international community. First thing, when it comes to legality, there really is only one game in town, and when it comes to use of force in an R2P context, and that is Security Council approval under Chapter 7, or Chapter 8, the regional organisations, which is an alternative way of getting to formal approval. Other than in self-defence cases, which are very rarely the context here under Article 51 of the UN Charter. There is, from time to time, a rearguard effort mounted by the lawyers in the UK Foreign Office and sometimes by the United States State Department, some attempt to argue that there is now some kind of customary international law which justifies the use of force without Security Council approval in cases of impending or threatened use of weapons of mass destruction, or maybe indeed even in mass atrocity crime cases generally. As much as I would like that to be the case, I have to say, from lawyers' perspective, it's complete nonsense. You only get to be established as a rule of customary international law when there's a long record of custom and practice, together with endorsement by the great and the good among the international law academics and so on, but custom and practice. And you just cannot say that there's anything remotely resembling universal buy-in to non-Security Council authorised use of force in these sorts of cases. It just doesn't exist. So legality can only be satisfied by Security Council or Chapter 8 authorisation. Legitimacy is something else again, because I think it is now very clearly understood that some cases can be legal but not legitimate, other cases can be legitimate but not legal. Legitimacy involves satisfying multiple criteria, which have now been pretty clearly identified, not in any General Assembly resolution, not in any Security Council resolution. We nobody wants to go down the path of trying to debate these things and get formal agreement about it. But in the report of our Commission, in the report of the Secretary-General's high-level panel on threats, challenges and change, in multiple other commentaries, it's now pretty well universally accepted, I think, that there are 5 criteria of legitimacy which really ought to be satisfied before you go down the path of using force, not only in R2P cases, but indeed in any case. First criterion is that the risk of harm, or the threat of harm, is such a character, nature, magnitude as to prima facie justify the use of force. There's no way of defining that more precisely in numerical terms, but there has to be some kind of threshold of seriousness of impending harm before you can even start thinking about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is last resort. The notion that every other non-military... No, the second one is... Let me go down in order. The second one is proper purpose, proper intent. This is the subjective criterion, very hard in practice to wrestle with and articulate and identify, but we sort of know it when we see it and know it when we don't see it. That is the primary motivation for the use of force in the case in question to halt or avert catastrophic harm being perpetrated, or is there some other motive, whether it's oil or bananas or whatever? Very often the case that there will be other motives in play, but is the primary motive, the main compelling driving force that justifies the case being made, is it the moral one of preventing, halting, averting atrocity crime? Third criterion of legitimacy is last resort. Is this the only reasonable way of addressing the situation, or is it the case that non-forcible options still have some prospect of success? This is often misunderstood, the last resort criterion, as requiring endless patience while you hang around while the weeks, the months pass and you wait to see if sanctions have worked or something else worked. No, it doesn't mean that. It means there being the reasonably available judgment that on all available information, nothing else is likely to stop the harm in question than use of military force. And this is exactly the kind of consideration which justified the Benghazi, the Libyan case. If you'd waited around to see whether sanctions bit or, whether Gaddafi really was going to be deterred by the prospect of International Criminal Court prosecution, there would have been 10 or 20,000 people dead and blood on all our hands as a result. So last resort doesn't mean waiting, but it does mean a reasonably available objective judgment. The fourth criterion is that of proportionality. Is the nature of the response in terms of its magnitude, its duration, its severity, proportional to the nature of the threat, the harm that's being caused or that you're seeking to avert. And again, I think part of the problem in Libya was that the force was appropriate to the civilian protection objective, but it was a disproportionate use of force to move up the scale to regime change. But the notion of proportionality, I think everybody understands. And the fifth criterion of legitimacy is really the most critical one in many ways, and it haunts the discussion and properly should of everything else. And that's the balance of consequences. When you put it all together and shake it, is more good than harm going to be done by military intervention? Or are you so uncertain about the consequences of military intervention, or so well aware that there is going to be catastrophic collateral damage involved to so many more people as a result of it, that it's just not a sensible course to undertake?